A Guide for the Perplexed by Maimonides. Moses ben Maimon, 1135 to 1204, a work on metaphysics and theology, transcribed in 1190. The principal ideas of which are: those who have become perplexed about religious matters as a result of studying philosophy, can be helped by realizing that scriptural writings may often be understood in a figurative sense. It is precisely because of the difficulty of understanding the divine that metaphor becomes useful in religious utterances. Once the necessity for an indirect approach to religious matters is admitted, faith becomes a way of relating oneself to a being whose mystery is understood metaphorically. From Moses to Moses there was none like Moses is a famous phrase which indicates something of Maimonides' place of importance in Jewish thought. The first Moses represents the origin of the great Jewish religious tradition and the Jewish law. The second Moses stands for, as is now well known, an attempt to reconcile this inherited tradition with the growing Arabian and Western philosophy and culture which were being absorbed in the 11th century. Intellectuals of his age were perplexed by the disparity between the law, which meant so much to them, and the philosophical sophistication they could not resist acquiring. For them, Maimonides provided a guide as well as a new summary of the law, both of which were so successful that they have now become classics in the religious tradition as well as in secular philosophy. Can Maimonides once again serve as a guide for our time, or does our situation require new prophets? We can begin by an inquiry into the way in which Maimonides met the need of his own day. Maimonides addressed his guide to those who had studied philosophy and had acquired knowledge, and who, and I quote here, while firm in religious matters, are perplexed and bewildered on account of the ambiguous and figurative expressions employed in holy writings. End quote. We are not then beginning here with philosophical reason and attempting to find a religious view which will fit it. Moses' audience was from the beginning firmly committed to its religious tradition, but now that philosophy has penetrated religion, the question was never one as to whether religion should be maintained, but only how it was to handle its philosophical content. Maimonides wrote for those whose religious roots were deep and who had held to religious practice. I quote, "The object of this treatise is to enlighten a religious man who has been trained to believe in the truth of our holy law, who conscientiously fulfills his moral and religious duties, and at the same time has been successful in his philosophical studies." End quote. This is not the description of a hollow man. It is not difficult to see why such a person was lost in perplexity and anxiety, caught in tensions he could not easily resolve. His religious training was too deeply ingrained even to consider surrendering it, and yet the new sophistication made philosophy naturally attractive. It is not that such a person had for the first time become an intellectual, since as a Jew he had inherited a long and subtle intellectual tradition, but that formerly reason had worked only within the law, while afterwards philosophy took this same reason outside the law and offered it new and alien foundations. This was the general cause for concern, but the Guide for the Perplexed focuses on the particular problem of trying to explain certain words in Scripture central to the religious tradition whose common interpretation sets them at odds with philosophical refinements. Reason never ceased to accept the law, but it found it difficult to accept any teaching based on a literal interpretation of the law. Furthermore, the perplexity had to be met by finding a way to live with it, since to surrender either the law or the newly found philosophy was unacceptable. Moses' attempt is never to try to remove the source of the anxiety, as might seem natural, but to try to find a way in which to adapt to it. To surrender religion would mean to break down the context which gave meaning and continuity to Jewish life, but to surrender philosophy would be to no service to religion either, since it would leave religion still disturbed by the unanswered philosophical questions. To reject philosophy would not remove the objections with which philosophy perplexes religion. Since there could be no escape from perplexity, it had to be met and accepted as the starting point and the necessary condition. Maimonides' first step toward meeting this perplexity is the ancient one of suggesting that the offending words in Scripture may also be understood in a figurative sense. While this is the general line of Maimonides' reply, he was quick to see that it would provide only temporary relief from perplexity, unless backed up by an explanation as to why it was necessary to use figurative language in the first place. This he began to do by explaining that even in natural science, some topics are not fully explained, that most difficult problems cannot be thoroughly understood by any one of us, and that since men differ in degree of intelligence, truth is withheld from the multitude of ordinary men, and therefore their objections can be ignored. The necessity for metaphor, it seems, cannot be explained until men are convinced that reason allows only a few to reach great heights, and that even here they must all accept final limitations. If such is the case, we are forced back to metaphor as the most adequate means available for expressing what we do know. If all obscurity should be removed from the subject, then literal terms could be used without reservation. Since literal description is completely successful only where all tinges of mystery can be removed, the acceptance of metaphorical expression depends upon the existence of some sense of mystery where God is concerned. The purely philosophical mind might have difficulty accepting mystery, even in the case of God, but what must be recognized is that Maimonides wrote for a man overtly religious and for whom the sense of mystery in the divine nature did not seem at all abnormal. Maimonides was not fooled, it is important to note, into thinking that an allegorical interpretation of religious literature is a full explanation to a philosophical mind. Instead, the intention of this method is to show that a philosophical religious mind, the reasons why to ask for a complex exposition in these matters is an exorbitant demand. The difficulty of understanding a literal impossibility arises only for the intellect, for the intelligent, since the ill-informed do not recognize a possibility when it appears. Yet the intelligent observer, who can admit the plausibility of a secret meaning, need not reject the difficult religious doctrine at once, since he can treat it allegorically as well as literally, to see if it may be accepted in this second mode. What is important to see here is that for Maimonides, the literal meaning was never to be rejected, but was always to be retained along with the more subtle metaphorical treatment. All of this can serve to relieve a philosophical perplexity, but interestingly enough, it can do so only for one made sensitive to the limitations of human reason through a religious tradition. Without the religious sensitivity, no solution can be found. The religiously untrained person simply cannot see the need for metaphorical expression. It takes some acquaintance with God, which only a religious discipline is likely to provide, to convince one of how difficult a matter it is to deal with the divine. When the mind comprehends one thing, it tends to think that it can comprehend everything. But it is just this view of knowledge which must be guarded against, if the metaphorical method is to be successful in dealing with man's perplexity. If there are no limitations set for the mind, everything would theoretically be open to literal interpretation. Metaphor can become meaningful when the mind finds that it cannot go everywhere directly. Metaphor is the shortest distance between 2 points only when the direct path is not open to the human mind. Here is the paradox. The religious spirit, which feeds on the sense of the final mystery within the divine nature, leads to perplexity when brought into contact with philosophical optimists, and its literal one-level mode of statement. Yet the only hope for the reconciliation without surrender is that a sense of divine mystery might force us to see that a frontal attack is not possible in the case of God. Thus, allegorical interpretation provides a genuine basis of latitude, which alone is generous enough to retain both the religious sense of the divine mystery, never fully disclosed, together with a philosophical directness whenever possible. I've just eaten, by the way, that's why I'm... Anyway, never mind. Where was I? Such an interpretation of mystery and literalness, together, which requires metaphorical expression, opens the way for a genuine meaning for faith. By faith we do not understand merely that which is uttered with the lips, but also that which is apprehended by the soul, the conviction that the object of belief is exactly as it is apprehended. That was a quote, by the way, I should have said. Maimonides talking about faith. I'll go through that again, because this word is so ambiguously used. By faith, we do not understand merely that which is uttered with the lips, but also that which is apprehended by the soul, the conviction that the object of belief is exactly as it is apprehended. End quote. Which I think is a good summing up of faith. If God is not directly approachable by literal means, faith always concerns something seen only incompletely through the figure of a symbol. Such belief can not be compelled, but if the necessity for indirect approach is admitted, in the case of objects exceeding the limits of direct grasp, metaphor becomes meaningful and faith an appropriate and possible way of relating oneself to such a being. If all things were open to direct knowledge, a relation of faith could only seem unnecessary and inappropriate. Metaphor is not completely successful or controllable means of communication. We can employ only inadequate language where God is concerned, and metaphor is the best method at our disposal, since it allows the mind to get around barriers by subtle and indirect means. And here's another quote. We therefore make the subject clearer and show to the understanding the way of truth by saying, He is one but does not possess the attribute of unity. End quote. Here we seem to contradict ordinary expression, but this may indicate only that we are dealing with no ordinary object. By negating part of the phrase in the figurative statement, we cause the sensitive mind to pass on to a grasp of God's nature, which could not be given by direct statement. What we learn from this example is that, and I quote again, we cannot describe the Creator by any means except by negative attributes. End quote. Metaphor and negative theology, then, are natural companions. Positive assertions about God allow the imagination to mislead us, whereas proof by negation leads us gradually to more perfect knowledge of God. The mystery involved in the divine nature turns the ordinary situation around so that we can now be convinced that certain qualities must be negated, whereas we cannot be as sure of positive attributes as we might be in an ordinary instance. The method of negative attributes is necessary, and I quote, to direct the mind to the truth which we must believe concerning God. End quote. But it could be adopted only by one who felt the presence of mystery in the divine nature and realized the inappropriateness of frontal attack. Our only complete knowledge concerning God, it turns out, and I quote, consists in knowing that we are unable truly to comprehend Him. End quote. God alone comprehends Himself, and one not made aware of these matters too quickly jumps to the conclusion that man can know nothing about God at all. The truth lies somewhere in between, and it requires an energy of religious interest to keep from slipping into either extreme. God may be approached, but only by indirection. The negative method provides the mind with positive apprehensions of the divine nature, but not such that all mystery is removed, since God remains never fully comprehended by any being other than Himself. Thus Maimonides has provided a context in which the perplexity may be stabilized, but it is not a simple solution. He speaks to men whose sense of religious tradition is basic to them, and thus he is able to call upon their religious discipline to hold a flexible position which does not go all the way in either direction. The use of metaphor allows the literal meaning of the ordinary religious language to remain, while making room for the more subtle and refined meaning of the term in philosophical usage. A willingness to grant metaphor a legitimate and applicable as legitimate and applicable depends upon an agreement that knowledge reaches its limits, at least in the case of God, and it is almost inconceivable that one should allow this limit to be placed on knowledge philosophically unless he had experienced some feeling of the mystery present in the centre of the divine nature. Recognizing the difficulty, we employ the negative method to protect us while we look directly into the light, and the knowledge we achieve will not seem contradictory as long as it is regarded as at least partly metaphor and symbol. If a man's religious sense is strong enough to feel this, he can accept metaphor and control the anxiety which philosophical sophistication has brought to him. This is the guide for the perplexed, but only for one whose perplexity stems from a strong religious tradition and its accompanying sense of the mystery encountered whenever the mind is turned toward God. Turning to Maimonides' doctrine of non-literal or metaphorical interpretation, we have to ask with him, what is it that allows us such a duality of meaning without simple equivocation of terms? Maimonides' answer is that this is possible only when one finds himself dealing with a kind of existence not capable of reduction to a single level, and one is not likely to grant this if he has lost all sense of mystery in the divine nature. Philosophy can be counted on to take the mystery out of the natural order, as well it should, but it cannot be asked to provide one with some feeling for the irreducible mystery in the divine nature. The cultivation of the religious life provides the datum upon which philosophy applies itself in order to develop theology, that is, the rational statement of the divine, insofar as this is possible. But if theology is not to become pure philosophy, the devotional life must be provided. It must have provided it with some sensitivity regarding the difficulty of handling God on our own terms. In spite of this rather clear framework and simple objective, the casual modern reader is likely to be struck by the elaborate scholarly nature of much of the guide. The opening pages are entirely given over to an exegesis of the use of certain Hebrew terms, all of which are central to Jewish religious thought. Interspersed is a discussion of the limits of man's intellect, as well as an appraisal of the value of studying metaphysics. Such a diversity gives a correct picture of the blend of religious thought, scholarly study of concepts, and traditional philosophy, which makes up the guide. Then follows a more or less standard consideration of the nature of God and of the attributes appropriate in him. It should be realized that the scope of the guide is as wide as all traditional theology and religious thought. It is by no means simply a piece of philosophical apologetic, as might be thought from its title. Maimonides correctly sees that the only adequate way to provide a guide out of any perplexity is to take up and to discuss all of the major theological issues. To do so successfully is to provide the best, most substantial guide that can be produced. After considering the traditional attributes of God, such as unity, incorporeality, the second Moses begins part 2, with a discussion of 26 propositions employed by philosophers to prove God's existence. Next comes the question of creation versus the eternality of the universe. And Maimonides sets forth as best he can the way in which a doctrine of creation, ex nihilo, can be justified philosophically. Philosophers and the prophets then occupy him, as one might almost guess, for the Jewish tradition demands that prophecy be made acceptable. Visions are discussed, but evil and divine providence, as always, are the two central problems in this section. A religious belief in God runs into its greatest philosophical difficulty in trying to reconcile its conception of divinity with the evils and difficulties of the world. It is easy to see that what Maimonides has provided is actually a comprehensive summa of traditional religious belief and philosophical tradition. Out of this meeting a theology is born, although its material setting within the literature of Judaism makes it appear less abstract than most modern questions. The guide is actually a vast compendium of philosophical and religious material, which is then given shape through Maimonides' attempt to draw answers out of this combination. The towering position of influence which he occupies within the Jewish tradition gives some measure of his success. Philosophy and religion in certain areas treat the same questions, but they do so in quite different ways and in quite different settings. When they are kept apart, as they can be in some ages, no conflict arises. Whenever an age becomes generally sophisticated philosophically, as was true in Maimonides' time, and is also true in our own day, then perplexity is bound to come. To those who can drop neither perspective, some reconciliation of the two bodies of material must be made. Out of the attempt to reconcile philosophy and religion, each age arrives at a new theological perspective, which has implications for both technical philosophy and the religious life.